real delight to be able to share with you information on Beyond Belief, a major exhibition that we've been working on for at least the last year with the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Jean Garrity, our curatorial assistant, has been my right-hand person, left-hand person, the major, I mean, as much of a mover shaker on this whole project as I have been. What we're going to do is a collaborative presentation. I'm going to introduce the major themes, and then Jean's going to follow up with information about each of the artworks, and I'll chime in, you know, if there are any questions. But as you all know, Beyond Belief is a collaboration with our neighbors across the street as they plan their closure for the next 2.5 years. We're the first collaborative exhibition that the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art is working with. We're very excited about that because we're going to be able to bring over many treasures from their permanent collection, which normally never leave their walls. These are major artworks: Mark Rothko, Jackson Pollock, Franz Marc, major works that are beloved by the institution, and people internationally travel to the San Francisco Museum to see. So it's a great privilege for us to be doing this. Now, I'm going to go ahead and, as you all know, Beyond Belief explores the spiritual dimensions of modern art. And what is interesting for me is that we're going to be taking classic artworks from their collection and seeing them through a different lens. So when you go to the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, you see things in a chronological order, kind of sort of given their layout. So you'll see minimalism, abstract expressionism, surrealism. They're all kind of clumped together in these art historical movements. What we're doing is taking a lot of these works that are seen in that context and mixing them up and looking at them through the lens of spirituality and particularly Jewish theology as best we can. We don't want to force anything on these artworks. And in fact, one of the things we've been very cautious about is doing a lot of research to make sure that whatever spiritual dimensions we bring to the artworks are true to the artist's intent. So now I'm going to just say, now, how was the artwork selected? You're probably going to be getting a lot of questions by visitors. So San Francisco Museum of Art cast their net wide, looked at their collection, and said, okay, we want to work on this theme with the CJM. And so they came up with a large checklist of works for us to consider. And then subsequently, Jean and I, working with Janet Bishop, the curator of painting and sculpture at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Corey Keller, their curator of photography, and Caitlin Haskell, their assistant curator, and Peter Samus, their curator for interpretation, with Dan Schifrin on our staff. We had these major powwows saying, okay, what makes sense? And ultimately, we winnowed down this large grouping of works, saying, okay, these are works that we think we could make an exhibition out that makes sense for our institution and also emphasizes, you know, aspects of Judaism. Now, I suspect that, and I'm talking very frankly to you all, that people will wonder how we can encapsulate 100 years of spirituality in 62 works by 49 artists. We're doing the best we can, given the fact that we're working with a sister institution, and that's just a given. This is collaboration, working with their collection, and we want to celebrate that because they're sharing their resources. Now, the other thing is, in our introduction to the exhibition, we explained that there are very fluid ways of categorizing some of these artists. So, for example, Agnes Martin, who traditionally has been seen as a minimalist, we're looking at her through a spiritual lens, work as it's been influenced by Buddhism. But somebody else will say, well, Agnes Martin, or well, why don't you look at this other way? All I can say is this is a curatorial prerogative. Anytime a curatorial staff come up, they put together what they consider their best judgment on a theme for an exhibition, and they put it out there. And that's what we do. I consider, the reason I love working in a museum is there's no right answer to art. Mm-hmm. And I consider an art museum like a library. There's, you can have a book about a certain subject, and there are multiple interpretations on that particular subject. In fact, that leads me to the whole idea that, in fact, the exhibition is based on the Talmudic notion of questioning rather than answers. And I will be the first to say I don't bring a lot of Jewish knowledge to the exhibition. I bring museum experience and art history experience, and I've relied on Dan Schifrin, who is very knowledgeable about Jewish theology and practice. He's helped guide our decisions about the themes for the shows, how we posit the different parts in the exhibition. So, that said, we only have 9 artists of Jewish heritage in the exhibition. And I'm going to name them: Helene Elan, Wallace Berman, Helen Frankenthaler, Adolf Gottlieb, Philip Guston, Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, and Alfred Stieglitz. That being said, I think nonetheless we have a very rich exhibition, because the whole idea about the exhibition is spirituality, and we're folded in Judaism in this. And the names that we have in our exhibition are major figures in American art. Now, the other thing is, when I was working with Janet Bishop with the curatorial staff and reviewing the works that they were suggesting, I felt very important. I felt it very critical to make sure we represented women, different generations of artists, and also different cultural belief systems and religious affiliations. So that also prompted some of my decisions, our decision. So now, as we go through the exhibition, based on Dan's,
I don't have a clicker. It does. That won't advance your slides.
Oh, I've got to sit here. Okay, here, let me do this. Based on Dan's recommendations, we divide the exhibition sets. So here's the exhibition overview. We have 10 sections, and the headings often reference Jewish theological beliefs, but also we're folding in artists that have reflected on Buddhism, theosophy, 19th century theosophy, Christianity, Islam, and different schools of spiritual thought. So this is the layout of the exhibition. We are aptly beginning with, this is the exhibition entrance, beginning with Genesis, going to divine architecture, God in the abstract, or the secret language, God in the abstract, presence, moving on, the world to come, video work by major figures, Without End, Hidden Revealed, and Lost in Redemption. Those 10 sections have headings all based on, as I say, Jewish theological beliefs that Dan and Janine and our education staff help us with. So now, the other thing is, I want to make sure you know that throughout the exhibition we have what we're called orphans. They're artists that don't necessarily belong in categories. Then I'll point those out as we go along. The exhibition actually begins in the lobby. Oh, okay. I should probably I just like to face people when I show you. we are bringing over Barnett Newman's major sculpture, Zum Zum. This, I don't know if you've been over to San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, but it was on their rooftop garden. It's a huge, 8-foot sculpture of weathering steel, zigzagging. And the whole idea is you can walk through the sculpture, and it's a play off of Zum, the Hebrew. Now I don't know.
Tzimtzum.
Zum. Okay, the whole idea. Do you know? Okay.
Explain it to us, just
Okay.
or if you want me to explain it, I'll explain it. But no, but I don't think.
I can also explain.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure of that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, you can elaborate, Judy.
Sure.
But the whole idea is in the beginning, God in the beginning created, wanted to have this vision of the world, and then when he had it, he retracted, and then wanted to give the world to humanity, and it's Zum, which is like a,
What was left?
what is it?
It's a
Go ahead, Jenny.
so like a contraction or and jump in here, Nahama.
Contraction
A
is
contract God. So it's a Kabbalistic story about the creation. So in order to make room for creation, God had to contract within himself to make room to create. But there's also this idea that there was sort of like this shattering when this happened, and that there's a little spark of divine light in every element of humanity and every element of creation, actually, not just humanity. So, and a lot of, I've heard a lot of people saying like Zimzum or like whatever, but I think this is just the way he spelled this idea that's Tzimtzum, which means a contraction.
Well, and it's also it's a piece that you can actually walk through, and when you walk through, you feel very compressed by these large, weathering, huge pieces of steel. They're like compressing iron. And then when you walk through, it is like this opening, the ray of light.
Cool.
This will be in the lobby. The idea of putting this major sculpture in the lobby is that it's setting the tone for the exhibition, that you prepare yourself psychologically, emotionally, according to the term, in the Hebrew term aliyah, which is meaning to ascend or to go up. And as I understand it, means that many, Jewish people want to, go to Jerusalem, ascend, and find their spiritual base. So what we're doing is setting Barnett Newman in the lobby. When you go up the landing, we'll be having these major quotes by various artists, Jewish philosophers, and then we will go up, and where the Kinda Wiley videotape is, we'll have this piece by Stephen DeStabler. Stephen DeStabler is a California artist that is known for his semi-abstract pieces about angels and humanity. I think it's a wonderful way to introduce the idea that we're dealing with humanistic issues, but also on a spiritual basis. This will be on the landing where where the Kinda Wiley is. So we'll walk you through this. So moving on, when
Excuse
we
me,
enter
where in the lobby is?
you know where the Kinda Wiley videotape is?
No, the Zum.
It's right when you walk in the lobby. And it's going to be overwhelming.
Only because, I'm doing the architecture tours and we wanted to show the part as well. Is this going to be?
It's going to be right in front of the part as well.
Okay.
It's going to be huge.
It won't be blocking, okay.
No.
You'll be able to walk through though, also.
Okay.
And it's getting installed Wednesday, I heard.
It's all tomorrow.
I
But,
had no idea.
The great thing is, when you bring visitors in and do your architecture tours, you talk about Pardes, and then you talk about Tzimtzum,
Okay.
all which bring in, Jewish, those important Jewish beliefs.
And then they asked me about the ping pong table.
Well, that, we're going to get rid of those.
Thank you, that's what I wanted to hear.
I don't even understand.
And I'm going to make a note to email everybody because I didn't realize it was being installed so soon. So,
So moving along. So we have in the entry, when you first walk into the gallery, on your right will be this piece by Namjoon Paik, who is a very highly regarded Korean-American video artist who recently died, well, maybe died about 2 or 3 years ago. His piece, TV Buddha, and the reason why I wanted to put it at the entrance is to show that after Zimzum, the Jewish, a very important artist who deals with Jewish theology, to show that the exhibition is dealing with a broader scope. And also contemporary artists, video, media. This is a piece where the Buddha is looking at itself on this circuitry where it's just self-reflecting on itself. And to me, it's a wonderful way to bring in the whole breadth of the spirituality issues, and particularly since having been in the Bay Area for a long time, knowing how Asian philosophy, belief systems are really very important in this area. So moving on, thank you, Jean. Now, here we go. We're starting off with Genesis, and this is a story that we're telling through different eyes of artists, but particularly by female artists. So I'm going to have Jean talk about the individual works now.
Okay, so yeah, as Karen mentioned, we're looking at Genesis through many different lenses, not just the story of Genesis in the Bible, but also the idea of Genesis, the beginnings of something, and particularly from this sort of feminist perspective of the woman's role in bringing life into the world. So this is a work by Helene Elon, who is a Jewish artist who was actually raised in an Orthodox family and eventually became a feminist artist, so had quite an interesting change in her life and sort of trajectory. And she just wrote an autobiography, which I haven't had a chance to read, but I heard is really fascinating. So ritual is something that was really important to her in her life. Just growing up, there was a lot of rituals in her life, which is something she's spoken about, and she kind of created her own rituals through this series that she called Breakings. And this is one work from that series. So she would pour about 1.5 gallons of linseed oil onto these large, like 6 by 8 foot pieces panels, which was paper attached to plexi. And the linseed oil would kind of form this sack that she compared to the amniotic sac. And then months later, she would leave it like that for months, and then she would invite people to what she called breaking ceremonies, where she compared herself to a midwife. And in front of, friends or just people that were interested, she would break open the sack and it would just drip down the panel and form these kind of unexpected forms. So it was completely open to chance, and she considered it kind of like the birthing process.
And excuse those rigid lines. Those are the reflections of fluorescent lights.
Yeah, you can see like a ladder. This is a terrible picture.
It's a bad picture, but it's basically very organic. The only thing I would add is that Helene Elon, when she created this work, it was during a period of a lot of conceptual performance art, where artists were doing very unusual things. They were challenging traditional painting and sculpture, and they were interested in performative art. So that hopefully that will help kind of explain the context. We'll have on our website. By the way, we're going to have live iPads scattered throughout the gallery on our website that Dan Schifrin is creating. She talks about the process of creating this piece. Okay, so there we go.
And this is a work by Ana Mendieta, who is a Cuban-American artist who is deeply influenced by the ancient cultures and religions of Central America. And she also, her work is often considered feminist. It has a lot to do with the female body and the body in nature. and she often uses nature in her art. Like this work is actually composed of tree roots that are woven together, and actually with beech she uses glue to kind of form this primordial Mother Nature type figure here.
I think what I find fascinating, and if you have questions, just jump in, but that she calls it stem mother, which is actually made from roots of a ficus tree. And then she does, as Jean said, she comes from a feminist point of view and looking where creation, where the world was formed.
What's interesting to me about this piece is that I think it makes me think about stem cells and this idea that stem cells are this sort of like
totally.
generative.
Exactly.
But this was created long before all this research happened about stem cells and the importance of stem cells. So think about like birth and genesis and like the ability to create life. And so that's my
absolutely.
resonance with that title.
Absolutely. She was ahead of her time.
Yeah, that's right.
As artists usually are.
This is a sculpture by Kiki Smith. It's going to be pretty striking. It's this bronze life-size sculpture, maybe a little smaller than life-size, that is going to hang on the wall. And Kiki Smith is known for, she did this series of kind of historical female figures, and she had a solo exhibition at the Israel Museum in 1994. And prior to that, she traveled around Israel kind of looking for inspiration for making work for this exhibition. And during that time, she heard about the story of Lilith, who, I don't know if you're familiar with this story from the Talmud, but some people in the Talmud said that she was Adam's wife before Eve, but she refused to serve him, and so she was banished from Eden, and then Eve was kind of the second wife. So of course that's kind of like in the Jewish mythology. And since then, Lilith has become a feminist icon for many people.
Can I
There's
just
a magazine.
like a
called
Jewish
Lilith.
feminist
Yeah,
magazine?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to
no.
jump in and
First feminist. She was the first.
Didn't even know she was the first one.
share something, just like a little bit of additional information, is the background, and I'm sorry if everybody knows this already, but in Genesis there are two different versions of the story of the creation of man and woman. There's like the first one, it's like on the sixth day, God created man and woman, and it sounds like it's happening kind of simultaneously. And then you jump forward,
Male and female.
male and female. You jump forward, and then you hear the story that kind of we think of with where God forms man from the dirt and breathes the breath of life, and then takes the rib and forms Eve to be his helpmate. And so the reason this Lilith story kind of came about is there's this question about like, well, okay, if we had woman and man being created originally, like what happened to that first woman? So there's this hole in the story, so it's sort of filled in with this midrash, this story about Lilith. That's what happened to the first people. So that's where it comes
That's
from.
interesting because it folds into the whole idea of the exhibition deals with the questioning, the Jewish tradition of questioning and saying what's going on, the dialogue. Basically, it's a dialogue that I think is very interesting. Okay, moving along. So divine architecture, this is a section where we deal with how the perception we reach that, God created the world kind of as an architect does. And as Judaism suggests, the physical world actually represents the presence of God. And what we've tried to do with several works by modernist artists is to semi-abstract works, mostly realistic works, but to evoke the sense that God is this wonderful creator, and to evoke a sense of mystery and awe as we look at their work. George O'Keeffe, one of the works we have is, we have a quote that we'll be placing with work. She said, "I found I could say things with colors and shapes that I couldn't say in any other way, things that I had no words for." And these are what the artists are doing. They are painting representations of the landscape or photographing because they just feel the presence of a great power that they can't articulate. So Jean's gonna go again.
So this work is called Interior Landscape, and it's by Helen Frankenthaler. Frankenthaler was a Jewish artist who grew up in New York City. She was part of the New York School, which included the abstract expressionists, so she was a pretty prominent painter during her time. And she developed this unique technique called the stain technique, where she would dilute her paint and then pour it onto unprimed canvases, and the canvas would then soak up the liquid. So she also didn't have complete control over the finished product, and that was kind of what was sort of thrilling for her in that. And this work is called Interior Landscape, so there's kind of the tension between the personal interior thoughts and feelings, and then it does also look like a landscape in a way.
And if you have questions, jump in. I have to say, Helen Frankenthaler was a secular Jew, and there's a lot of research that we did to find out how she thought about her work, but she was one of the most successful female artists during this time in the 1960s, when a lot of male artists were doing abstract work. And at the time, in the 1960s, late 1950s, early 60s, artists didn't talk about spirituality. They were more, and this is where, during this period, most critics who were actually Jewish always talked about the formalist aspect, the color, the composition. They didn't talk about what meaning was behind the work. So just to put this all into context for you, and this is where art, depending on the period you're looking at the art, the context can change.
The exhibition includes 4 very small photographs by Alfred Stieglitz. You can see they're only about 4 by 4 inches or something like that. Although they are very small, they are very important in art history. Stieglitz was obviously a photographer, but he was also an important advocate of American modern art. He had 2 galleries in New York City at different points at the beginning of the 20th century that were very influential and kind of helped pave the way for modern art in New York and in the United States. So he made this series called Equivalents, which were these very small photographs of the sky. And you can see there are no reference points. It's just these shots of clouds. So they were actually seen as some of the first examples of photography as its potential as an abstract art. Because even though we think of photography as an art form now, back in those times it was thought of more as a documentary form, something where you could take portraits. It wasn't thought of something that could create abstract art. And I just wanted to read this quote from him. He had written this to a friend in a letter. He was talking about this new series, Equivalents, and he said, "Several people feel I have photographed God. Maybe."
Maybe not.
He is one of the important artists in the exhibition, even though his work's only this big. And from Hoboken, New Jersey, born and raised in Hoboken, New Jersey, immigrant Jew, but actually kind of tried to remove himself from his Jewish heritage. So it's very interesting how these artists perceive their work, in terms of Judaism.
And this is the work that Karen mentioned by Georgia O'Keeffe, who a lot of you are probably familiar with. She was actually married to Stieglitz for a while and involved in the New York art scene, but she also spent a lot of time in the American Southwest, and a lot of her work reflects the natural landscape, kind of the stark nature of New Mexico, where she was living. And this work it's called Black Place, which was an area near her home in New Mexico, and you see these hills, these kind of rolling gray hills, and then it's really hard to tell in this slide, but at the very top of the canvas, kind of at the top of the hills, is a little patch of green, And this is kind of a recurring motif in some of the works in the exhibition, that that mountains or hills will kind of lead you to this spiritual apex, and there's this hint of life at the top. This work by Franz Marc is called Gebirge, which means mountains in German. And similarly, it's mountains kind of leading up to this sun at the top of the canvas that can represent this spiritual apex. And Franz Marc was he was one of the founders of a group called Der Blaue Reiter in Germany, which means the Blue Rider. He founded it with Vasily Kandinsky, and they wrote a lot about their beliefs and their artwork, and they firmly believed that abstract art and bright colors could express spirituality, and that it was their role as artists to express this spirituality through abstraction.
Any questions? You can see it's a real mix. Okay, we're now moving on to a section called The Secret Language, and this explores the notion in Judaism that mystical symbols, codes, words, or writing have importance, even though we may not totally understand the meaning. And even the artists, I have to say, often don't understand what they're creating at the time. So there's a term, gematria, correct me if I'm wrong, Janice?
No, you got it.
Which is Hebrew for geometry, and a piece like this by
For
Wallace Berman.
numerology.
Numerology. In Jewish tradition, or Kabbalistic tradition, the Hebrew letters can be associated with numbers, and there's this layered decoding or uncoding of these words, especially among the Kabbalistic mystics, that is very complex. But Wallace Berman is an epitome of this whole idea of Kabbalistic gematria, and I'll let Jean talk about the piece.
Yes, so Wallace Berman was Jewish, but he didn't speak Hebrew. He hadn't been taught a lot about Judaism growing up, but later in life he kind of became fascinated by the more mystical side of Judaism. And he often incorporated Hebrew letters into his work, although they wouldn't form actual words. For example, in this work, I believe that in Gematria, the Hebrew letters actually correspond to the numbers that are in the title, so it's untitled 400.300.50.
It's the first.
Or at least the first few correspond to 400.
Yeah, it's the first three. The taf is 400, the shin is 300, and the nun is 50. So
Okay.
it's going from left to
Hmm.
right.
Right. Okay. So anyway, he was more fascinated by the shapes and the way that the letters looked than by conveying any actual meaning through the words. And it's also sort of important to note that Wallace Berman was a member of the Beat generation, which connects back to Ginsberg and the show downstairs. And there are actually, I think, 3 artists that were Beat artists in Beyond Belief, so that's kind of an interesting connection.
Now, the one thing I will confess that we were so hung up on the Hebrew letters that we didn't really address the chain.
Mm-hmm.
So when you walk people through the exhibition and they say, what does the chain mean? It's up to you.
You say, what do you think it means?
Yeah. You say, what do you, I mean, I think it's a very provocative work because it opens up a lot for questioning. And it's something that we curatorially didn't address, even though I think it's as important as the Hebrew letters on the stone.
I mean, from here, it almost looks like it's heart-shaped.
Yeah, I was.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
fascinating.
I saw a heart as well.
Yeah. And the chain thing takes on even more meaning, or potential meaning.
Well, you know, this is great. This is why the questioning technique.
Right.
What does it mean to you? Because we don't know, and I don't think Wallace Berman told us.
Can I ask a question about Berman?
Yeah.
Is this similar to his other work or vastly different?
He
or-
did, he was actually part of the whole Beat generation, and much of his work incorporated Hebrew letters in two-dimensional work. They were called Verifax collages. But also he was, back in Los Angeles, he, you know, how we talked about Ginsberg and his, the obscenity charges. Well, Wallace Berman in Southern California had a piece about, I think it was Christ on the cross or something, and a very well-known gallery. And he, again, like Bruce Conner, Allen Ginsberg, were accosted by police and had, you know, saying this is obscene, is inappropriate. And you have to understand, these artists were working, well, this is a bit later, but these Wallace Berman, Allen Ginsberg, they were working in the 50s. Bruce Conner, they were working in the 50s where they were doing beat unorthodox work, which was totally antithetical to the uptight 50s Mad Men generation. And so they were the revolutionaries. So this is a little bit later, but it's very the use of Hebrew letters and the mystical, mysterious, unfathomable notion is very characteristic of his work.
So this is a major work by Jackson Pollock, who I'm sure you probably know is one of the major abstract expressionists. He was very influenced by surrealism and Jungian psychoanalysis, and this work is earlier than his more famous drip paintings, which he developed a little bit later. He grew up in Wyoming, and he was influenced by Native American culture. This painting has a lot of elements of Native American culture. They're kind of like totemic figures on either side of this rectangle in the middle. There's a little Kokopelli at the top, and there's some sort of canine figure lying at the bottom. But truly, this work is a mystery. I think it's generally assumed that the mystery is whatever's in the rectangle in the middle that's being guarded by all these figures, but lots of people have debated what the mystery could be, and there is no real answer that we're aware of.
Would we think of it was a mystery if it wasn't called Guardians of the Secret? Like, I feel like that says so
Yeah,
much.
that
Like,
says a lot.
you might just think, oh, it's a framing device and like something, you know, central, but it's interesting to think about.
I have a question about that. Somebody told me that he actually didn't name it, but that a friend named it. Is that just a...
That I haven't heard, that I haven't read. He did.
I didn't know. It's just a... And you said Kokopelli? Is that what you said?
There
Or something?
is-
What is that?
There is, if you look up, I mean, there some art historians. Do you know Kokopelli in Southwest?
I don't, actually.
Well, in Southwest Native American art, there's a figure called Kokopelli, which is a figure blowing on a flute or something.
Oh, okay.
But if you do you see it right in the center? It's this-
You can point
if
with
you
your,
look up Kokopelli,
cursor.
Kokopelli.
It's like on a lot of hippie jewelry.
Interesting.
Yeah, now I am. Like, when you said flute, I was like, oh,
Okay.
I see. Mm-hmm.
But there are also, you know, we've read a lot about Jackson Pollock, and, you know, we went through Jungian psychoanalysis. And this was, you know, we don't know, no art historians know what this means, but some identify the, you know, the Native American roots and the mask from Native American roots. And even the animal down below, some people call it a dog. And then I later said, well, maybe it's a wolf, because he later did a painting called She-Wolf. So anyway, whatever.
Thanks.
Looks a little Egyptian.
Yeah, it looks
That's
very,
what it
yeah,
is.
yeah, totally. I think it's a word that's
Something
very
for
open
everyone.
for interpretation.
This work is by Shazia Sikandar. She is a contemporary artist. She's Pakistani. She's actually going to be she's going to come to the museum, and we're going to have a program with her in conversation. I think it's August 1st, so we're really excited about that. This work is composed of fragments of the national epic poem of Laos, which is called the Sang Sing Se. It's often recited in Buddhist religious ceremonies. So what she did was she kind of took the actual forms of the written poem and scrambled them to the point where you can't read it. Even if you did read Urdu, I believe it's in, you wouldn't be able to make out the words. So she's kind of in this way speaking to the power of memorization and recitation in religion. She's spoken about how she memorized and recited the Quran growing up, but she never really understood anything that she was saying. So she really turns the words into something more sort of decorative and aesthetic.
I think that will resonate for a lot of our Jewish visitors who may just know the Hebrew prayers because they've heard them over and over, but don't know what they
Really?
mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a fascinating work in relationship to what's going to be in this section. It's hard to appreciate this. Hopefully, when you see it in the gallery, you'll
I actually like it.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome.
really, yeah. And then, okay. So now we're in presence. This deals with the intangible notion of human presence, and also the intangible notion of a spiritual presence. So in Jewish theology, there is a term called hamakom, which means literally the place signifying God's presence that can be felt everywhere. Now, what we've tried to address in this situation is artists that are not only addressing the spiritual presence, but the human presence in the big world. And and particularly at a time when the world is going through a lot of changes, most of the artists that are included in this section created the work during or after World War II. And so these artworks touch on a sense of a little bit on existentialism, which is the whole notion of humankind's place in the world. How do we deal with the sense of the absurdity, the tragedy, the humor in the world? And so this is where artists are dealing in a semi-abstract way of addressing this. Okay, I see you studying. Is it okay? Am I making sense? Is it making sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Again, I just want to make sure.
No. I mean, I think that's the timing is very important. When you talked about the Second World War, is people had to deal with the atomic bomb.
Okay, yeah, exactly. And so this is what these are. I just want to make sure I'm connecting with you because this is a very disparate and huge exhibition. So this is what we're dealing with. So now, Clifford Still.
So this work by Clifford Still was originally called Self-Portrait, and you can see it's like a very vague representation of a person. He was influenced by primitive art, kind of like cave drawings, that sort of very prehistoric work. So you can see that influence here somewhat. This is a pretty early work, and he eventually moved on to completely abstract work, which is what he's more known for.
One of the things that Janine, correct me, but this would be a perfect opportunity for Dustin to say, if you were to create a self-portrait, how would you describe yourself in color or line?
Yeah, and there's lots of interesting. We're actually next week with the educators. We're going to talk specifically about kind of gallery extensions and activities and art making.
Because when I see this, I think, wow, what is it?
And then you think of something like a Giacometti, or there's a lot of different images. Is this section also dealing with sort of the idea of graven images and prohibition against, or is that a different section? I can't remember.
That's in the abstract.
Thank you. Getting confused.
Alberto Giacometti was a Swiss artist who was associated with existentialism, as Karen was talking about. His sculptures are often of humans. They're kind of very thin and have jagged edges, suggestive of the isolation of the human experience. And the contrast between these durable materials that he uses, like bronze, with this sort of fragile emotional state that he is conveying, that works as an interesting contrast in his work. And he also, was working in the years just after World War II, where in Europe existentialism was also very significant.
This is a portrait of his brother, Diego, who was also an artist and created furniture and design, just so you know.
Adeline Kent was a Bay Area artist. This work sort of looks like a primitive icon, but incongruously it's made of magnesite, which is a common construction material. So it's just kind of, there's a reference to sort of the banal, even though the work is very powerful when you see it. It's called Presence, and it has this combination that she often used of figuration and abstraction. There's this hint of a figure, but it's also very abstract in its own way, and there are these kind of empty spaces within it that suggest both presence and absence. This work is by Adolf Gottlieb. He was a Jewish artist who is an important member of a New York school. It's called Demon of the Night. He was fascinated with the spiritual aspects of African and Native American art. And this work is part of a series called pictographs that he did, which were based on ancient cave drawings. So they're kind of divided into these grid-like forms with abstract and also somewhat figurative shapes within them. And he has talked about how he was very affected by the Holocaust, and he incorporated themes of evil into his work in the years immediately following World War II. And this was in 1946, and while you might not look at this and think that it looks evil necessarily, there's some hints, and also the title is Demon of the Night, which is pretty menacing.
I think Jean helps to shed light that during this period he created a number of paintings with this grid-like surface. It had negative connotations, evil of the night or evil of the day, but it was a whole period of just coming to terms with that, also within that his interest in primitive art and archaeology.
And the problem is that with some of the stuff that we see today, this almost looks comical.
Yeah.
Well, I think then.
So I mean,
think
I guess I'm sort of anticipating people's reactions to it as, not taking it seriously the way others can do.
But I think that's a great thing. I won't point the camera at you for when I say this, but
Very good point.
I think it's a really interesting question. Like, how do we react to this today? And you can have a conversation about it. So, and you can leave that space for people to say, like, wow, it looks so benign. And what are we used to seeing? What might it have seemed like then? I mean, I think that can be a conversation rather than necessarily maybe a point of ridicule, but just this.
No.
Yeah.
At the time, you can probably, if people bring that up, you can probably say, at the time, this was pretty radical. Even though, from our perspective, however many years it is, it's not, and I think it's an interesting point that some work may hold up stronger over the time than others.
And on the 11th, when Julie Charles from SF MoMA comes to talk to us, she's going to talk a little bit about kind of modern art and when you say modern art, what kinds of things were modern artists experimenting with and rebelling against, and what existed beforehand. So it'll be a little bit of an art history 101. So to think about like why this was revolutionary, because what came before it.
Actually, this is interesting because I think the next time on a show like this, we should create a little more context so you can see how Vanna Mendieta's work probably fits into the bigger picture. We come from a curatorial background where we have the art history, but, you know, and I know you bring a lot of knowledge, but I think it's helpful to have the other visuals.
And we have some documents like that
Yeah,
that we can
okay.
share back to the whole
Yeah,
staff.
totally, yeah. Before and after. Okay.
So as Karen mentioned before, some of the works don't fit into specific categories, and this is one of them. This is Wally Hedrick, who is also a beat artist, and it's called Orb of Power. He was known for kind of his humor and his puns in his work, especially like verbal puns. And this is a painting of a jeweled Russian ornament that he jokingly gave to himself as an award for being a hero artist. So it's actually, you know, around the time that that Jackson Pollock was being really revered as an artist, and he had this big article in Time magazine, and people just really looked up to him. So in a way, Hedrick is kind of poking fun at that a bit, and he's using the iconography of the Christian cross as this thing that isn't, you know, is very rarely used in a humorous context, and he's putting that into the work.
I think one of the things we also say in some of our interpretive material is that people like Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko are considered priests of high art. And what Wally Hedrick here is doing is looking at it in a more humorous way and saying, what does an artist do? What do they achieve? Who achieves stature, whether it's a Pierre Mondrian or a Franz Marc. So it's we're mixing a lot of things up.
This is another work that's not in a specific category. I don't know if any of you saw the Jay DeFeo show at SF MoMA, but she was also a member of the Beat Generation who is well known for making these very large works that are oil on canvas, but she builds up so many layers of paint that it looks almost sculptural. And this work is called The Veronica. And the title refers to a bullfighting maneuver involving a pass with a cape. So you can kind of sense the motion in it of a cape. Or maybe you can't. But I think that's sort of the idea. And something that DeFeo may or may not have known about, we're not sure, is that the bullfighting maneuver was actually named after a story in Christian Apocrypha that Saint Veronica gave Jesus her veil to wipe his brow after she sort of came across him on the path, and he handed the veil back to her, and his face miraculously appeared on the cloth. So that's kind of an interesting connection to this spirituality. And this is another orphan work by Mona Hatoum, who's a Palestinian artist. She was born in Lebanon. She now lives in London, and much of her work kind of addresses issues facing Muslims who've been exiled around the world. And this work it has the same dimensions as a Muslim prayer rug, and it goes on a platform that goes on the floor. And it has thousands of pins that are facing upward. So there's this suggestion of kneeling to face Mecca in prayer, but then there's also this sort of menacing quality that you know it's actually going to hurt you if you do that. So that's kind of open to interpretation, you know, what exactly that means.
It looks like it doesn't look very interesting in the slide, but I think it's going to be very powerful when you see it in person. So God in the Abstract. This is going to be a section that you may have some trouble with because people have a hard time with pure abstract art. But this section deals with artists, and particularly very important artists at the turn of the 20th century that decided to turn their back on figuration and embrace completely abstract art. And we've tied this into the whole notion of the second commandment, where you do not create graven images of God. So we are starting off with, one of the major artists in this section is Vasily Kandinsky, who in 1911, well this is Mondrian, but I'll have but there are they're all abstract artists, but they're all very important artists in terms of turn of the century art, introducing spiritual themes that rely on abstraction. So I'll have Jean take care of this.
So this is a work by Modrian, and Modrian and his friend and collaborator Theo van Doesburg were two Dutch artists who founded the De Stijl movement, which is the style in English. And they firmly believed that abstract art was the best way to express the spiritual, and they focused on primary colors in black and white, as well as horizontal and vertical lines. So this work De Stijl was founded in 1917, this work's from 1914, so it's a couple of years before they founded the movement. And you can see that Modrian is really moving away from any sort of realistic representation. This is called church facade, so maybe you can see some elements of a church in it. But yeah, he was really moving towards his sort of signature style.
I'll just interrupt. This is a quote that I use often when I make presentations. This is by P.M. Mondrian. As you can tell from the title, this is an abstraction of a church in Domburg. But he says, to approach the spiritual in art, one will make as little use as possible of reality, because reality is opposed to the spiritual. Thus we find ourselves in the presence of abstract art.
Oh, grandiose, but
Pardon me?
It's a little grandiose, but it's okay. You know.
No, but I mean, I'm just telling you what
I mean,
where these artists are coming from. Because even today, I think it's a
Oh
big.
no, I think it's a really good question, because like, which came first, the spirituality or the abstract art?
Well,
I mean,
it was an evolution. It's like, no, it's an evolution as he started off as a realist painter
okay,
and gradually felt
And so the two
that
of us
it
were
was through abstraction
parallel.
that he could embrace,
Yeah.
that was the expression of the spiritual in
Okay,
art.
okay.
No, because he did, actually, this, if we, this gives me, we could have had the realistic renditions of the paintings from Domburg, whereas a church, a realistic, and gradually, it's a little bit like, I mean, this is kind of pedant, but, as you get older, you say, I need less and less.
Yeah,
I need less and less.
because, yeah,
I don't need all this stuff. And you pare it down and you get down to the essence.
right, you throw away 90% of
Yeah,
what you
exactly.
needed
And
the
that's, you say,
10%.
what is my essence?
Well, I mean, ironically, when I look at this, if someone didn't tell me what the title was, I would think it was a graveyard.
Well, that's interesting. And that's interesting. I think that's
Because it
fascinating.
ties into this, because it ties
Yeah,
into the
yeah,
idea
yeah.
of part
I
of
think
what
that's
ties the
absolutely
church,
fascinating.
is the church is,
I think that's a very valid, I think it's a very valid perception, because that's, once an artist, well, I don't know if Janine would agree, but my theory is once an artist creates a work, you put it out in the world, they're not around to say, no, that's not what it means.
Yeah. But I think also, per the earlier point about kind of which came first, it's my understanding that a lot of these artists, the modern artists, were responding to an increasingly industrialized world, and they felt that this industrialized world was alienating and sort of the human spirit was being extinguished by increased kind of mechanization and industrialization. I mean, that's a little bit earlier than this, but
No, I think, no, that's absolutely right.
so I think a lot of these artists are really searching for spirituality in the wake of modern life.
And that may be the reason why 100 years later this is the one that's being exhibited. Who knows how many artists there were whose paintings aren't, because he
Yeah.
did capture. What
But it's interesting because, even to my point, I was interpreting it at a more mundane level, but it's, my metaphor about downsizing.
Yeah.
Or, clearing things out, I think a lot has to do with the whole idea of mechanization and,
Yeah, you're trying to hold on
Get
to
to
what's
the core.
essential.
Yeah.
Yeah,
hold
I think
on
that's
to
great.
the core.
So Theo van Doesburg was the other founder of De Stijl, who is not quite as well known, but this work is probably what you're more familiar with as a iconic work of the De Stijl group. So he was really trying to purify art in the service of spirituality is sort of the way that he described it. So he felt like he was expressing the spiritual by really paring down the composition. And just a kind of funny anecdote is that Mondrian and Van Doesburg eventually parted ways kind of acrimoniously because Van Doesburg believed that using a diagonal line was okay, but Mondrian was not okay with diagonal lines.
Very interesting.
But isn't it interesting how the diagonal line doesn't go all the way to the end of the canvas?
Oh my goodness.
And the horizontal line doesn't go all the way.
Yeah.
Were they respected artists in their time?
Very. And Van Doesburg, these artists that are in this section, they all were, not turn of the century, very important movers and shakers, introducing abstraction into international art.
So we have 5 small works by Paul Klee. He was one of the members of Der Blau Reiter, which was another group that I mentioned earlier, was founded by Franz Marc and Vasily Kandinsky, and they were also connected by a common desire to express spiritual truths through their art. And you can see some of Klee's work was sort of more abstract, and some had figurative elements in it. Angels were a symbolic motif that he often used that kind of served as a bridge between the physical and the spiritual worlds. And this work on the left with the red is called "A Spirit Serves a Little Breakfast."
And it's all of 8 inches by 5 inches, so it's very tiny.
Yes, all the work, well, the work we're showing of Klee's is all pretty small.
Can I ask a question before we move on? I'm just curious about, in terms of Distill and Blue Rider, do they have, what's that?
Oh, right, so there was one that we didn't mention, suprematism.
Yeah, so, but just to stick with Blue Rider and Distill for sort of a general question, but when we talk about they wanted to express something spiritual in their work, were they connected by any religious beliefs, or do we know where they were, where their roots were, or if they were connected to religious affiliation?
Well, one of them, Kandinsky, was very involved in theosophy,
Okay.
which is a complicated 19th century movement that had its beginnings in Europe and then jumped over to the United States, and Madame Blavatsky, who is actually acknowledged as being the major advocate for theosophy. And basically what it did is just try to create a belief system or theology that united the natural world with the spiritual world. And that's what Kandinsky and the Blue Rider and the De Stijl artists were all doing, and they all, it was basically Kandinsky that was influenced by theosophy, and I'd have to go back and research it. But Kandinsky's book concerning the spiritual in modern art came out in 1911. It was a very pivotal work for a lot of European artists, as introducing both a sense of spiritualism and abstraction in art. And then the Blue Rider evolved around 1911, 1914, and De Stijl around 1917. So these artists all converged at this very critical time in Europe, early 1911 to 1920.
But they weren't all like Christians, or they weren't all. They was all. Yeah.
They weren't. No,
That was-
they were artists first, and they all actually were they all influenced each other.
And they weren't really like.
They weren't
related
religious
to-
per se. They were
Yeah.
they were trying to find art as a means for spiritual.
They weren't connected to organized religion.
Yeah, they weren't connected to organized religion.
Can I share a
Theosophy
quick
was-
anecdote also?
Yeah.
So my job before this was at the Guggenheim, and the history of the Guggenheim Museum was started as a museum for non-objective art, and the core of the collection is the Kandinskis
Kandinsky.
and the Mondrians, and
Right.
so this all of the abstract artists, especially those who are interested in this spiritual. And the original Guggenheim had all the artwork was hung really low, and they had music piped in, and they had seating and carpet because it was designed for people to sit and have this spiritual experience in with this art that was supposed to evoke spirituality. So it's interesting just to think about. And that was, gosh, it opened in 1952, maybe something like that. So even as late as the 50s, this artwork was still, seen in this spiritual light.
No, that's good to know. It's good to share. Okay, moving forward.
This is a very large work. It's kind of an installation, sculptural installation that we are really excited about having. It hangs from the ceiling, and it's made up of thousands of colored silk threads. You can walk around it, and it looks like it's kind of undulating. Even like a little breeze will make it move slightly. And Teresita Fernandez is a contemporary artist who is, a lot of her work is kind of inspired by natural elements, and this is called fire. And fire is often seen as a spiritual element. And she's also going to be coming to the museum to speak on September or October, I believe.
It's going to be a fabulous piece. Master of Time. This is a section of 3 artists, video artists, that we've selected. They deal with the whole notion of mortality and time. And the only thing I can say is that, in the book of Psalms, it is said, Lord, remind me how brief my time on earth will be. Remind me that my days are numbered, how fleeting life is. I think it's a lovely quote, and this is what these artists are dealing with, the fleeting nature of time.
This is a 15-minute video by Daniel Reeves, who actually lives here in San Francisco. This was made in the 80s. He was traveling around India, and he kind of took these sort of video snapshots of everyday life that he witnessed. And there's a voiceover of him speaking about his experience. It's inspired by, the work is inspired by the verses of the Indian mystical poet Kabir, who wrote poetry in the, 15th century, and also influenced by Bhakti philosophy, which was a Hindu idea that was developed during this era of Indian epic poetry. So there are also some poems like interspersed in the video. It's hard to explain the videos. You'll have to come and watch them.
It's a beautiful piece.
Do we have links or?
It's a beautiful
I think 2 of them are on. This one you can't see, but the other 2 are online.
Okay.
They're clips of life in India, people walking, people washing, people with sound and music, and then this narrative of the Hindu poet that is read. It is it's a lovely, lovely piece. 14 minutes, but well worth the time.
This work is by Gary Hill, who's a video artist who's known for integrating video and text. And in this work, the camera kind of pans around this table of relics that are suggestive of death, like small bird skulls and dead butterflies, kind of crumpled papers, shells, rocks. So the camera will kind of zoom in on one of them, go into focus, and then go out of focus. And throughout the video, Gary Hill is reading this kind of philosophical text that he wrote. And it's quite short, it's only 4 minutes.
The world to come. In Jewish tradition, as I understand, they refer to life after death as the world to come. And the artists that we have included in this exhibition address in different ways notions of the afterlife. So,
This is a work by Bruce Connor, who also is a member of the Beats. It's called Sound of One Hand Angel. And he was very interested in exploring spirituality in much of his work. This work is life-size, so it's a photogram where the artist laid down on photosensitive paper and then shone a light on it, shined a light on it, which created this silhouette of the artist's body with this extra hand right in the center. So it clearly looks sort of evanescent and almost spiritual, and of course it has angel in the title, so it has this sense of otherworldly.
Bruce Connor actually didn't lay on you may get a number of questions. He actually, photosensitive, have you ever done photograms or something? Okay. There's this light-sensitive paper. He posted stuff in different ways, and he had a colleague, a friend, flash a light on this light-sensitive paper.
Oh, so he wasn't actually lying on it?
No. He's actually standing up, as I understand. But he did a whole series of them, probably 18 or 20, and they're different poses of him as this beautiful light-infused form. So this is the one that we're including in the show.
This work is called Nights Not Nights. It's actually very hard to see in this reproduction, but it's a pretty beautiful work in person. Ross Bleckner was he is a Jewish artist working in New York. He's a contemporary artist. And this is actually, it's a black canvas with little stars and then some small forms look like hands that are sort of grasping for the stars. A lot of his work in the 80s addressed the AIDS epidemic. So this could be interpreted as like hands grasping at stars, sort of the desire to elude death.
With that in, this is a very small section, only includes 2 artists, but it addresses the Jewish idea that we don't know the limits or contours of God, and I think it's referred to as Ein Sof, meaning without an end. Basically that the divine is unknowable, and there are 2 very abstract works that we've put into this category, into this section.
By Mark Tobey, who is an important figure in the Pacific Northwest. He was a devout follower of Baha'i, which I don't know if you're familiar with that religion. It was founded relatively recently in Iran, and it believes that all religions will eventually become one. So it kind of encourages people to, marry outside of their religion, stuff like that, so that everyone will kind of convert to this one religion.
There's a temple in Israel, north of Israel.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
There's
in
one
Haifa,
in,
right?
I think
Really?
so. I know
Wow.
it's
There's one in Evanston, Illinois,
there's one in the
too.
Mission.
There's one in the Mission, really?
Yeah.